Like magic. All right, hello everyone. My name is Lot. I am finishing up a PhD at the University of Oxford, and on the side, PhDs don't earn very much. I've tried to consult a bit in the mining industry on lithium deposits. So that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. It's a slightly different talk maybe than what you might be expected. I thought it'd be good to give a bit of a crash course on pegmatites and what we can know and what we don't know, and how we can use those understandings and lack of understanding to leverage new technologies to streamline or reduce uncertainties in the discovery process. So pegmatites, this works. There you go. Pegmatites are a source of a variety of commodities. It's most famously known for its source of lithium, but in fact, it is actually the main source of a variety of critical raw materials on both the US and EU lists. So a lot of the doom and gloom that we have in the lithium space don't necessarily apply to all pegmatites as a whole. But I will focus on the lithium side, and I personally do think that the fundamentals are quite strong in the lithium space. And I came across this graphic on my LinkedIn profile last week by Benchmark that I think illustrates the problem quite nicely. Whereas copper, we need quite a significant absolute increase in demand. The relative increase in demand that is coming for lithium is much more significant. We have to effectively double our production in the next 4 to 5 years, and the next 3 years after that, add another 1 million tons again. And to put that into perspective, it took us 70 years to get to the first 1 million tons, which is about where we're at today. And that just highlights we need to be able to discover more, and we need to be able to implement them quickly to be able to meet that demand. There are two main types of lithium deposits. People will often hear about brines and hard rock deposits. This was a report that was released a few years ago now in 2022, and it released, or show the laser, yeah. It had some pretty big, exciting deposits out there that still haven't been implemented. So part of the issue is not necessarily just can we find them, but also implementing them in an ESG component as well. Now, despite that, pegmatites are uniquely positioned to be able to be put online very quickly. The processing is often relatively simple. It doesn't rely on technologies like direct lithium extraction, where brines are becoming the hot and sexy topic. And so for the short to medium term, this is definitely where a lot of the exploration will come from. So I've said the word pegmatite a lot. I know not everyone might be familiar with that word, and it's actually a somewhat non-trivial question that I'm asking of what actually is a pegmatite. And I'm going to give a somewhat academic definition to that I've come up with, which is it's a highly evolved igneous rock. And what I mean with that, it's an igneous rock with a lot of incompatible elements within it, and has textures that are indicative of disequilibrium during crystallization. And what I mean with that is pegmatites crystallize very rapidly. That's their distinguishing feature. So a pegmatite on the order of 50 meters wide can often crystallize on the order of, in some extreme cases, days up to maybe hundreds, and the most about 1,000 years. And that is on a scale that is unheard of in other igneous deposits, where they work on the orders of millions of years. And those disequilibrium textures come out as a variety of different features. So one example is what pegmatites were originally defined as, was these graphic intergrowths. This is quartz and feldspar that crystallizes so quickly that it's unable to separate, and we get these beautiful cuneiform textures. You see this on the micro scale, and on the right, you can also see it on the hand sample scale. And to me, these would be beautiful granite countertops. We also see different kinds of disequilibrium textures. So on your left-hand side, you can see what are called comb textures. So these are crystals that are growing perpendicular to the boundaries, and they grow into each other. And what you also get on the right-hand side is what's called line rock or apolitic banding, which again, all are indicative of very rapid changes in chemistry during the crystallization process. Arguably, pegmatites are most known for their large crystal sizes. This is me, bright and young, right at the start of my PhD, looking at a face in the US. Behind me it's 100% spodumene. They're all 2 to 3 meter long crystals. And sounds like big, but the largest spodumene crystals ever found were about 15 meters long in North Dakota in the US. And so that really highlights that these things aren't just microcrystalline systems. They can be really large, and all of that has implications on the downstream processing side of things. They crystallize in a relatively simple manner, and in many ways, they crystallize how you'd expect most igneous systems to work. We have a border zone. This is akin to our chilled margin in other systems. It has a very simple mineralogy. And then in the economic geology space, we tend to distinguish two different zones internal to that. We have a wall zone, which is unmineralized. So this is what was uninteresting for an economic geologist or from a deposits perspective. It's largely quartz and feldspar. But for the mineral enthusiast, this is often where the beautiful textures appear. So this is some nice fan textures of tourmaline crystals that come out from the margins. And from the same deposit in Brazil, you can see along the contacts of a smaller body, these comb textures on both sides as well. Internal to that wall zone, and this is where the really main distinguishing feature between the wall and what we call an intermediate zone is the mineralization. So once we have a primary ore mineral of interest, we determine that to be the intermediate zone. This is an example from a deposit in Namibia, where we can see we have spodumene crystals, which is our lithium pyroxene that we're interested in most cases, some micas, tourmaline quartz, the white is feldspars. Hopefully what you'll see there as well is that a lot of the minerals are white, and that makes these things often very difficult to identify in the field. And we'll talk a bit about what we've been doing with Evident to try and simplify that later on. So that intermediate zone is where this spodumene face is from as well. Finally, we have a little bit of residual melt left over. That tends to be crystallized as a pure quartz zone. These things are relatively overpressured in many cases, and they can fracture out. And they'll also release, or you have quartz veining internal in your pegmatite. You often see these beautiful quartz, coliform quartz veins that are running through your system. Now that's typically where most igneous systems end. Once the magmatic state is finished, that's where they finish. Pegmatites also have a hydrothermal stage. They tend to cook in their own juices, so to speak. And that can be both a beneficial or a deleterious process, depending on what metal you're looking for. For the lithium space, it's often a deleterious process. So the more it's been able to cook in its own juices, the worse that is for your exploration perspective. And that leads me to my first point, right? We have large crystals. We have a lot of zonation in many pegmatites, and that makes gram sampling often very spurious when it comes to pegmatites. So kind of the first takeaway is anytime you see a press release with a gram sample result, take it with a really, really big pinch of salt. Because not only depending on where in the pegmatite you're sampling, you might be completely negatively biasing your result, but even within the mineralized zone, unless you're taking a sample that's 500 kilograms or a ton, you're going to be biasing a result one way or another. You can be picking out pure spodumene samples, and that could be your grab sample, and you have a beautiful result. Or you can be picking something that you think might be spodumene, run into a dud, and it's nothing there. So that's then leads us to the question is what are the main components that make an economic deposit? What distinguishes an economic pegmatite from a non-economic pegmatite? And so the requirements really are threefold. This is really kind of a mineral systems thinking approach. We need to understand, we need to have a fertile source to extract, that we can extract a significant amount of lithium from. We need a structure that can then migrate that into a trap. And we need to then also understand the mineralogy and the preservation. And the mineralogy in pegmatites are really quite complicated, and I'll get onto that in a second as well. On the source perspective, to crystallize spodumene, again, this is the main mineral of interest that we have. We need to have about 5,000 ppm of lithium, which equates to 1 weight% lithium oxide in our melt. That's a significant enrichment relative to the average continental crust, on the order of about 500 times. So whatever concentrating mechanism we have has to be extremely efficient at concentrating lithium. To do that, geologists have come up with two main models of formation. We have an anatectic or a partial melting model, and a granitic or a fractionation model. And I'll just quickly talk you through what these are and why that might complicate the story from an exploration perspective a little bit. So this is the type locality, in my opinion, of anatectic pegmatites in southern Scandinavia. And an anatectic pegmatite is we have a low degree of partial melting from a fertile source, and that partial melt is then highly enriched in incompatible elements that can then be extracted and form a pegmatite. In that sense, we don't have a parental granite, which is a concept that's commonly put in place in the pegmatite exploration field. And the composition of that pegmatite is controlled by what you're melting in the first place, right? Not all pegmatites will have lithium. Not all pegmatites will have tin. It's all dependent on what source you have in the first place. On the other side, the kind of other end of the coin, we have the granitic concept. So this is really what's used mostly in the exploration field. And what that is we have a granite. As a granite crystallizes, we have residual melt. That residual melt, in principle, should become more enriched in incompatible elements. And if we have pulses of extraction of melt, they can form pegmatite aureoles around a granitic body. And supposedly, the furthest away pegmatite should be the most evolved. Now, that is often not seen, people try and shoehorn this model in many cases, and it's most commonly used model in exploration on it, for better or for worse. And one of the reasons that I think that we should really take care with this is we published a paper a few years ago now that showed that from a modeling perspective, neither model in its simple sense can get you to that 5,000 ppm concentration that you need. So in reality, what you most likely have to have happen is multiple stages of enrichment. It's such a significant step, and this is in many other deposits the same case, that you need to have a multi-phase system present. So once you have, irrespective of whether you're an anatectic source or whether you have a granitic source or some combination of the two, the next aspect that we need to focus on is the structure. And this is something that has largely been overlooked in the exploration field, not in other commodities, but in pegmatites. People get excited, they find a granite and they try and look around, walk around the granite and hope to find something. The structure really is much more important than we are led to believe. That's not only the case from a trap perspective, it's also from extraction from source. Pegmatitic melts are by definition low degree melts, either low degree residual melts or low degree partial melts. And because of that, they're physically constrained to be removed out of their system. So we need to have a way to efficiently extract them out of their source. And of course, more commonly with any other deposit, it also fundamentally has a control on the emplacement setting and where they go into the system. Pegmatites globally are spatially associated with regional structures. In the Archean, where most of the large deposits that we know of today are found, it's largely in crustal scale shear zones. Those shear zones seem to be extremely efficient in migrating the melt through the crust. That's not just the case in pegmatites, it's the case in many other systems. In the Phanerozoic and a lot of more modern deposits and new deposits that are being discovered, we seem to find that these systems occur in all kinds of structures, but most dominantly in post-collisional extensional faults. And some work that we've actually submitted earlier this week for publication suggests that transcurrent, so that's transpressive or transtensional shear zones, are really the most effective way at migrating melts or pegmatitic melts out of a system. And so therefore, from a desktop study perspective, trying to delineate regional structures is really, I think, a key aspect rather than just trying to find a source granite. The final component that I talked about is the mineralogy and preservation side of the story. This is twofold. One aspect is that the crystallization pressure temperature conditions has a fundamental control on what minerals precipitate. Unlike gold or other common base metal deposits, there's about 53 or 56 different phases of lithium where lithium is the major cation in the mineral. And fundamentally what affects which mineral precipitates is a control of the composition of the melt, the pressure, and the temperature. So in a simplest case, we often look at what are called the lithium aluminosilicates. So we hear of petalite and spodumene talked about a lot. Fundamentally, the difference between those two is simply a pressure temperature difference at crystallization. In some cases, you can have, like in the arrow that I've drawn there, is a system could start crystallizing in the petalite space and during cooling, enter the spodumene stability phase, and you can have both systems present in your environment. Likewise, if you have the right fluids in the system, you could completely recrystallize pre-existing petalite to spodumene, or in some extreme cases, vice versa as well. So if we want to find spodumene, which is our highest value lithium deposit, we need to be relatively high pressures. So that kind of equates to the upper green schist, lower amphibolite facies. So if we have that as our regional targeting, that helps quite a bit. The other aspect of the mineralogy and preservation is the preservation side of things. So what we call metasomatic alteration or fluid altered systems can really affect mineralization potential. Ironically, for tin and tantalum, which are the other two main commodities in pegmatites, this metasomatism is often a beneficial process. Tends to be where that crystallizes. But for a lithium system, we don't want this to happen. And this is an example of a lepidolite deposit that I worked on a few years ago, where we can see this albite, this white patches are kind of pervading through and destroying the pre-existing mineralogy. And in that way, we're losing value of our deposit. Now, the preservation also has a control on let's say we found spodumene. Not all spodumene is the same. So here's an example of a deposit, again, a different deposit I worked on. For those unfamiliar with cross polars, thin sections, this is a thin section. So we've got about 5 centimeters from either end to either end. All the rainbow colored material that you see is spodumene in this case. And hopefully you'll agree with me, and I've highlighted a couple in arrows. We have different textural variants of spodumene in this system. And that is largely, we'll have a magmatic phase of spodumene, and then we have different alteration phases that are precipitating spodumene as well. So this has an effect not only on, right, we might say, great, we've got an XRD result that we have spodumene in our system. That's fantastic. That's what we want. But we might then still run into problems downstream on the processing scale, right? Because depending on what proportion you have of large crystals versus small crystals, that will have an effect on comminution costs, what size you need to grind to, whether you can go down a DMS or a flotation circuit. And that all fundamentally comes down to understanding the textures, which are controlled by that mineralization and preservation potential. So to summarize these challenges before we go on to how we might be able to implement some new technologies into helping us with this. On the desktop study scale, we simply don't really have a robust grasp on what source requirements are needed. How deep do we need to be melting? How much do we need to be melting? And what actually is truly a fertile source? And therefore, kind of a main point I want to bring across is spatially associated granites are often incorrectly assumed as a source. Just because a granite is nearby doesn't mean it has to be the source. And that biases exploration efforts in many cases. And I feel like we might be wasting money in many situations where we're trying to look for potential pegmatites where they'll never be. And part of that is that pegmatites can travel several kilometers from their source through these host structures. And therefore that constraining those structures is often more important than simply constraining the source. On the validation target confirmation side of things, once pegmatites are discovered, the mineralogy isn't ever straightforward. It's often very hard to discriminate in the field. And lithium itself is also quite difficult to analyze quantitatively in the field through field-based methods. And therefore we have to rely on other more reliable, heavier proxies that we can measure easily and rapidly. So to kind of highlight a couple of examples that we've been working on to try and improve the discovery potential is we're going to talk a little bit about some source modeling that we've got. So I won't bore you with too much of the details, but this is really carried over from the academics metamorphic petrology space, where we can model or predict the stable phases and the types of melts that are produced at different pressure and temperature conditions. So what a client can do is they can bring us a bulk rock geochemistry analysis of what they think might be a source. And we can run some tests to say, is that a feasible source? And so to give that a bit of an example, I've just come up with a fake scenario here that we've got a series of granites. We have a greenstone belt with some metasedimentary successions in there. And we've identified a structure that is controlling. And we now want to expand our land package, and we want to determine what is really controlling our system. And so we want to see whether along that structure we need to be focusing on areas around granites, or we need to be focusing around areas that have these metasedimentary successions around them. So what we can then do is say the client will bring us some metasedimentary material. They run a bulk rock analysis, and we can then put that through our model and predict what kind of melts and what compositions of lithium those melts will have. And in this case, we'll get to about 500 ppm and say, this is unlikely to be the source of these pegmatites that we're looking at. So then we take a different approach. We look at the granite and say, okay, rather than predicting melting, let's predict fractional crystallization in a similar approach. And say, okay, can this granite ever get to the point where we want it to be in terms of fractionation? And we determine that, okay, really to get to the levels of enrichment we want, we need to get to 95% extraction. Could be feasible, but it is a bit of a stretch. Let's say we've then done some geochronology, or there's a PhD that was done there, and we find out that these granites are actually 100 or 50 million years older than the pegmatites around them. So there can't be that crystallization relationship. We could model the melting of these granites, and we can try and determine what PT conditions that we need to get the enrichment that we want out of these granites. And therefore we can target along those structures regions where we think that those PT conditions might have been achieved. So in this way, we kind of reduce the uncertainty and just land grabbing and trying to specifically target particular areas for exploration. The other aspect on the validation side, so let's say you found a new pegmatite and you want to determine whether it's worth drilling. What we've focused on is using heavier alkali elements, which we can rapidly analyze in the field. And the approach we tend to take is we want to focus on identifying individual mineral phases that are common throughout pegmatites. Again, because the crystals are so big, a single spot analysis, if you're hitting a quartz or a feldspar or spodumene, will be wildly different. So if you focus on a single phase, improve the comparability of your results. And really, what we've tend to found is that a potassium rubidium, for example, in most cases of less than 20, correlates strongly with elevated lithium values. And so this is an example of where a collaboration with Evident came through, is that this is where handheld XRFs, for example, are used in the lithium exploration space. Now, there's also the handheld LIBS as an alternative, which can measure lithium directly. And I think we'll hear some talks about that later on as well. But one of the aspects that we've decided, or what I thought was quite interesting with a handheld XRF, is we could potentially be able to use these as a way to identify minerals without directly detecting lithium. So just as a bit of an example, here are 3 different mineral phases that you commonly get in a pegmatite. Only one of those carries lithium, and I hope you'll agree with me that just looking at them, and even if I were to bring the hand samples out, hopefully you'd see that it's actually very difficult to distinguish between these phases. So a way to build your own confidence and a way to kind of help geologists in the field is we've developed a method that leverages geochemical fingerprints of these different phases as a way to distinguish between them. And we started off with a relatively small amount of phases. Here's a couple of examples with some hand samples that we had in the, at home, and it's since been implemented in the field with success. And so we can then effectively determine spodumene versus pedalite versus lepidolite versus quartz feldspar, and kind of build confidence on the early stage without having to spend a lot of money on XRD analyses or any other off-site lab analyses to determine, okay, is this worth any money at all? And just to highlight and finish up on that point, why that's important, here are 2 examples of core from 2 pegmatites. At the top, they're both very similar grade. One of them is almost all spodumene, the other one is almost all lepidolite. So just an assay value for a core interval tells you nothing about the value of that deposit. You really need to understand the mineralogy as well. Thanks very much.